Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm here with my good friend Allan Gregg for another episode of the Red-Tory podcast. Coming to you on a Good Friday that you would think is a little bit of a lull from the craziness we've had. We got the wrong date up there again. But I actually think, before I throw to you, Allan, one thing that I thought was quite remarkable today that is purely anecdotal is the lineups at advanced polls here in Canada. That social media today is a buzz with people eager to vote. So that's got to be a good thing. But we start, of course, every show by me asking you, hey, what have you been paying attention to?
Well, mostly the Canadian election, to be honest. We had the debates last night. They were worth watching. Some ancillary events are around that. You know, the advanced polls are interesting. I mean, the indication are from the public opinion polls that there is a higher level of interest, both because there's a higher level of importance, a threat that is on, and also because it's clearly a very competitive race with choices that are, if not starkly opposite, certainly decidedly different than we've had in the past.
Well, and I think, and unfortunately, this gets lost in the kind of polarized media environment, but I think both conservative and liberal bases are really quite energized.
Yeah.
That, you know, we know what's happening in terms of Carney because he is running such a successful campaign. But I think there is a similar passion, a similar almost even zealotry on the conservative side, partly because they're upset at liberal rule for so long, and I think they're anxious about it continuing. But the stakes are high in this election, which mobilizes people. But as you know, is also why I'm still so depressed about the NDP and their absolute collapse. And I actually watched a YouTube of my local all candidates debate. And, you know, I wouldn't mind talking about that a little later. But to come back to because, you know, we were looking at both the French and the English. And I only saw highlights of the French, but I'm curious what you thought about the French debate, because it is something that I think tends to be underreported in English Canada, but as you've noted, historically has often been very pivotal.
Yeah, in fact, I'm actually very surprised. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be with hindsight, but I in the moment, very surprised at how much latitude Francophones seem to be giving Carney for the lack of real facility in the language. I mean, he clearly can comprehend what's going on. He can express himself to the extent that the answers correspond to the questions. But I mean, I have seen, as you noted, in past French language debates, that lack of facility has almost been a disqualifier in the past. And it's testament to other stuff we've seen in the polls also, where, you know, the surprising sense of Canadian nationalism growing out of the province of Quebec, the sense of shared threat, the notion that the traditional purpose of the BQ, which protect minority linguistic and cultural rights, really aren't in much demand right now in that province. So, I mean, the general consensus is that the French language debate really didn't have much impact. If anything, there's some evidence, although it's not unequivocal, that it actually might have helped Carney a little bit more. And on the leaders, I mean, I'm also surprised. We've talked about character versus competence, is that, you know, I always thought that Carney's vulnerability was that he would be seen as if not an elitist, a technocrat, kind of a soulless manager. And I'm surprised, again, at how much enthusiasm a lot of current Liberal supporters have for him as a person, and not just as a manager. You know, people saying, and we had a little bit of the conversation with John the other day, is that, you know, we've got a real chance to be on the world stage with this guy. I mean, he can pick up the telephone and call anyone. He's got credentials that are recognized throughout the world, and and we're lucky to have someone with that kind of resume step up into politics, given what a cesspool it is and how much you're ripe for character assassination. On the other side, Poilievre too. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been surprised for a long time at the level of enthusiasm he can stir up at the grassroots level. I mean, you don't see in party politics 20,000 coming to a Canadian rally in this election, and that there is still a as much as people are looking for stability, there is still a big demand for change and a big premium played on disruption. And you saw that in the debates last night, is that, one of the real tests for Carney is not just that he's not Justin Trudeau, but that he represents a substantive departure from Justin Trudeau, not just on the personality, but substantively.
Yeah, and I think that's where the Liberals under Carney so far have been very successful, is they've pulled off this is not just a new chapter, this is a new regime, right? This is a completely new Liberal Party, whether it is or not, notwithstanding. But they've succeeded that, I think, from the messaging and public perception. And I do want to come back to the change piece, because I think that is going to be a potential liability for Carney upon victory. But I want to, one of the through lines we've had in our podcast, but I want to get into today, is the whole destroying the category and the way in which politics, electoral politics especially, has suffered from decades of just people crapping on it. Yeah. And I had this kind of image that Carney is kind of like this big leaguer coming to play in the minor leagues. That the category has been so destroyed that when you have someone with his bona fides, when you have someone with his talent, it's such a contrast that everyone's like, oh my God, it's the second coming. When in reality, these are the types of people we should have had all along. Yeah. Right? That we've always should have had people with this kind of expertise. We always should have had people with this kind of competence. And now the contrast is there, that there is, because it's not just Liberals. I'm seeing people who historically are left of the Liberals, critical of the Liberals, not necessarily diehard NDP, but oh my God, are they excited? And I see John Lefebvre, our last guest, as falling within that.
Yeah, it's very true.
And to me, I think it's because the category, the expectations were so lowered that when you do have someone who is capable, who is competent, who shows great potential, I think that is big. And I would love to see that continue. That is a source of hope for me. But this is also where I still have a problem with Poilievre, fundamentally. And I want to kind of bring this to a question. But much to his chagrin, the CBC actually fact-checked that 20,000 rally number, and they put it more closer to about 8,000. Still right? Very impressive, but I'm sure that pissed Poilievre off so much in terms of, oh, goddamn you, CBC. But the reason, like, I said this as an aside last episode with regard to Melissa Lantsman, and the same could be said of Poilievre. These are really capable politicians. These are really smart people. Your point about Poilievre's oratory skills also is totally fair. But it's all done towards hate. It's all done towards negative campaigning. It's all done towards dehumanizing and attacking the other. Like, to them, liberal is such a demon, such an evil thing, that when I meet people in my riding, like, they use liberal the way that other people use, like, idiot or clown or deplorable. And because I'm not a liberal, I'm okay with that. And I just kind of go with it. But do you think this is a consequence of just the success of negative politics? That a lot of political operatives, and I don't, because the NDP are doing this too. This isn't just the right, this is on the left, that they think the way to win, especially against someone as competent as Carney, is to just keep going negative.
Well, and listen, I've become a convert on this. I was one of the first architects of negative advertising because it works. And it works because it fuels that cynicism. I mean, if you believe that all politicians are crooks, it's very hard to say Jesse Hirsh is a fine human being and someone who really deserves your vote. It's way easier to say Jesse Hirsh is a bum who never has done anything productive in his life, and he'll fuck you around if he gets into office. The latter is more believable than the former. But as you notice, you destroy the category. And that kind of short-termism has worked very, very detrimentally to produce a vicious cycle. The vicious cycle starts is that, if this is all about destroying character, then people who actually value their character the most and have the most to lose by having their character attacked are the least likely to enter the fray. Mm-hmm. And so you get, just piling on and piling on and piling on. I've used many different analogies before, but, people who are in the packaged goods industry are smart enough to know you don't do that. You couldn't get market share by saying something horrible about your opponent. Your opponent can get it back by saying something horrible about you, but sooner or later they're not going to want your product anymore. And that's kind of where we've come today. When we talked with John, about democracy and believing in government being a pillar of democracy. If this is the only legitimate way that we can advance the interests of the whole, is through the political process. And so when you start eroding that, you really are going down a dark and bad hole.
And that is what worries me in terms of this continental flirtation with authoritarianism. That there's when I say both sides, I don't mean the traditional both sides. I mean the negative campaigning that both sides, the dehumanizing that both sides lend themselves to. We talk about it in terms of the use of the word deplorables, that the Democrats have successfully alienated a whole subset of the population. But I'm not suggesting we can answer this today or anytime soon, but I wonder how we turn that around, right? How we kind of get not just a humanistic, but a more constructive approach to politics. And where I have another observation that I kind of want to throw at you, which came again to looking at polls, because what I really like about your approach as a pollster is you don't treat the numbers as if they're gods. You treat the numbers as if they're an opportunity for original insight. And it's the original insight that then makes you as a researcher or as a campaigner effective. Because what I dislike about the current NDP, and if I think about it, this is the NDP of recent memory, is they can't think past the polls. Like, for example, they're doing it right now with healthcare, where clearly they've got some numbers that tell them healthcare is their wedge issue. Healthcare is the thing that they should be pressing. But I feel that they are kind of slaves to the numbers. They don't think, okay, there's an opportunity with healthcare, but to your point, we need a radical policy. We need something that really opens it up. And to me, it comes down to vision. That polling tells you what people are thinking, but it doesn't tell you the future. No. It doesn't tell you what's going to motivate people, what's going to change people. So do you think, because you're very critical of the polling industry and you're often critical of the way the media, gets into the bullshit of it all, are we locked into a determinism where people aren't thinking for themselves, they're just following the numbers, and that's part of why the category is being destroyed, because negative is the only thing that works, because no one's doing vision. No one's doing what you've talked about in the past of like civil rights leaders, where they have these really grand visions that build a big tent and get everyone behind them.
There's a tendency to overread the polls. It's read them too literally, and there's also a tendency on the part of the pollsters to dig in the wrong hole. That there could be all kinds of other areas that they're looking at, and you put those two together, and you get exactly what you're predicting. People following in kind of a very incrementalist, predictable kind of way. If you've done this enough, and you've combined enough statistical analysis with the more anthropological, qualitative research, you get to know. I mean, I remember again in the Charlottetown referendum. That there was, if you recall, I can't remember how many, there was 10 different promises, an elected Senate, Quebec as a distinct society. And, if you did a poll and say, do you strongly support, oppose, or strongly oppose each of those 9 things, each one had about 70% supporting. Mm-hmm. The prairies had way more supporting in Triple E Senate, and Quebecers had way more support in a distinct society. But basically, he said, if I just kind of go out there and run a campaign saying, if you really want Triple E Senate to Albertans, you got to vote yes in the referendum. You want to say to Quebecers, if you really want a distinct society, you got to vote yes in the referendum. And I was going through some tough times and at that particular juncture in my life, but hadn't done my regular Wednesday night focus groups. And we finally did these focus groups. We circulated also 19 million copies on people's doorsteps of what was in this Charlottetown Accord, talking about all these 9 specific things that we knew 2/3 of the population. And so the focus group moderator started and says, so what do you think of this Charlottetown Accord? And they all kind of looked at their shoes, and no one said anything. And this is, well, is there anything about it that you like or you don't like? And Everyone kept on looking at their shoes and didn't say anything. And finally, someone, after about 2 minutes of this awkward silence, says, I think they're going to have two senates, one for us and one for Quebec. And then you said, and how are you going to vote? And they went around the room and they went, no, 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 no. You said, why? And he said, because those motherfuckers want this so bad and I'm not going to give it to them. And if you recall, I mean, at the time, all three parties, labor unions, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, all supported this. And this was the rise in the early 90s of this anti-elitism thing. And so here we were overreading the numbers, the 2/3 supporting each of these things, feeding the electorate stuff that they weren't even looking at, missed entirely this underlying sentiment of resentment that everyone who's going to, basically impose something on them, that the average person at the time, this is coming off a big recession, you recall, too, in 1991, 92, thought was completely and utterly unimportant against the jobs issue that they were dealing with. This was the same time as James Caravel. It's the economy, stupid. Remember? Yeah. We're fighting the Charlottetown court. So that's a long explanation of just how wrong you can be, even if you've got the kind of experience that I have. The NDP is this is this week's Toronto Star article. I mean, again, watching the debates. He says, I was an advocate for childcare, $10 a day childcare. Who's against $10 a day childcare? No one really, except hardly anyone's adopting it. All of the operators are saying we can't run it at $10. The take up is only a fraction of the demand. There's another approach. You know what the approach is? If you're an employer, it is you must, by law, have a washroom, right? Because that is a right of your employees. Here's another right. If you have 1,000 workers, you have to have a daycare. Mm-hmm. Full stop. If you don't, you're not going to attract women to your labor force. You don't attract women to your labor force, you're not going to be competitive. You're an idiot. All the banks, all the major car companies would all have daycare. Or moms would bring their children to work with them. They could go have a drink with them at coffee break. It would be a whole different kind of regime, and Canada would be considered the absolute best place to work for women in the world. And NDP doesn't enter their head to even not to entertain something like that. And you know what? Back to public opinion, 90% of Canadians would agree with that.
Oh, 100%. And it's not just the NDP. I mean, we are right to pick on the NDP. But what you just described was a creative policy environment that does not exist.
Yeah.
Like, we should have an environment in which it's easy for someone like you, someone like myself, other smart people to float policy ideas that the public goes, fuck yeah, I totally want that. The same way that, like, you could even have it on the property development. Like, every high-rise corporate office building has to have a daycare, has to have again, they're really easy to solve these solutions, but we're trapped in this feedback loop. Because the other, where this brings us back is this agent of change piece. Because we've both acknowledged that that's where the right is, that they have legitimately the moral high ground, that they recognize the status quo is indefensible, that there needs to be changes. We're frustrated that the NDP, and you said it last time, I think quite eloquently, that the left has become incrementalist, right? Yeah. Defending the status quo and talking about little steps when people want radical change. People see a lot of their systems being dysfunctional,
and they're open-minded to that too. And this is where also I think public opinion is, or the knowledge of public opinion is an inhibitor to that kind of creative process that you want. I mean, I gave a speech to the Executive Association of Professional Public Services. These are all lawyers, engineers, medical people, the top public service. And it was on innovation in public policy. And I gave this talk, and it was at the National Arts Center. And then afterwards, there was a Q&A session. And some guy in the balcony says, give me an example of what that might look like. And I said, look, I'm not a public policy guy, but let me tell you, when I started on Parliament Hill, what was going on. That Mark Lalonde issued an orange paper on guaranteed annual income. Emmett Hall issued a green paper on tripartism, how government could be completely revolutionized by business, unions, and public service making decisions collectively. Jean Chrétien issued a white paper saying that they were going to abolish the Indian Act. So you know what happened to those three things? Nothing. But boy, did we have a fucking good debate around all three of them.
Yeah, no kidding.
You know, there was a
and
big
they're still relevant today.
But you know what that kid said? The guy who said that, he says, "Holy shit!" He said, "We tried that today. Would we ever be in trouble?"
But we wouldn't.
You can't. They believed you could not put a trial balloon out there that you weren't going to follow up on. That if you said we should have guaranteed annual income, the Canadian Business Council would say you're going to bankrupt the company and you would lose 5 points in the poll, and so why risk it?
But this is where
you get no robust debate around new ideas.
And this is where Trump has completely changed that environment, because not only does he do trial balloons, he just talks shit anytime he wants. Now this is where to go back to my fear that this moment of relief of, oh, finally the adult is back in the room and taking in charge of the government, or conversely, if and when the Democrats win the midterms, we're like, oh great, finally some non-authoritarians are back in office. That people's perception of change, of what change is and what change entails, that the liberals and the Democrats aren't even close. That they don't even have a clue as to, like, their vision of change is, to your point, incrementalism. And it's a kind of incrementalism that at best will raise expectations and not deliver. Yeah. Meanwhile, the negative campaigners, because one thing, so we've got Tobias Gibson returning with us on Monday. And one of the things I want to throw at him, because he left us last time with this is an attack on the professorate. This is an attack on research, on scholarship. I want to come back to Doge, because at the heart of Doge is this ideological belief that AI will outperform humans, that AI will be able to do a lot of this research, especially the quantitative and empirical stuff. And I believe it's all nonsense. I know it's all nonsense, but at least it's a vision. Like, at least they have a vision for a future civil service. At least they've got some kind of thing that they are running towards that especially amongst young men, they're going, yeah, okay, I'm down with that. What is the alternative vision? Yeah. You this is where, okay, let me pick on you, something you just said, because I thought it was indicative. You were like, oh, well, I'm not a policy guy. And that's true professionally. But compared to the general population, your policy skills are better than most people. And if the category has already been fucking destroyed, then there's no reason why someone like you or I can't float policy. Like, we can't write the policy, but we can say, look, we're looking at public opinion here, and we think this would be a good debate, or we think this would be a good like, that's what you and I would be excellent at, and we're not alone in that regard. And yet the left, the center left, does not tolerate that. Like, to your point, they are still risk averse. They are still, no, we can't do that sort of thing. And that's why the NDP, I'm rambling, but the last thing I'll say on this, the local candidates debate I watched, our progressive conservative, I think this is his 8th election, right? He is the chair of Giant Tiger. He doesn't need anything. He was really impressive. He was exactly the type of Red-Tory you and I would describe. He didn't do negative. He kind of looks like a cross between your younger self and your current self. He had a big long hair, looks like a hippie. He's not your typical conservative. That's one of the reasons he's popular. The Liberal was very Mark Carney, Team Mark Carney, very, very impressive candidate. And the NDP candidate was so stiff and cardboard and, like, just not present, like, not at all. And this is where I felt like there's a lot of interest in this election, but there's not a lot of substance, because where the NDP should be floating crazy policy ideas, radical policy ideas, because they're not going to win. Oh. They're just asleep and they're just sleepwalking to their death. And that bothers me.
But especially because this is an existential threat. I mean, the polls projections have got them down to 5 seats. They're gonzo there. And if that was the case, you know, and I don't think that's a Hail Mary, save the furniture strategy. I think that's smart on their part. But even if I'm wrong, why would you not send a signal out to people who are truly left wing that they are represented? in the system. But you're absolutely right. So the liberals would say should have $12 a day daycare. They'd say, no, we need $10 a day daycare, rather than offering, the kind of the solution that I just put forward earlier. And in terms of me saying that, I'm not a policy expert, I was just trying to be deferential to professional public servants. But you're absolutely right. And for all our derision around the United States, I mean, one of the things that has been very, very healthy in that democracy has been the voice of think tanks and the voice of academe in the public policy sphere, throwing things out there that have been the source of, if not controversy, certainly debate and discourse, and causing people to challenge the status quo and think about alternatives that may not be coming formally out of the political system. And we should be doing more of that in Canada as well. I mean, we've got a lot of good thinkers in the Public Policy Forum or the Institute for Public Policy Research or CD Howe, and they're like our academic community, they're just too inward turning. If they're talking to each other, they're happy. They don't really find any kind of need to find a larger audience beyond their more immediate constituency and network.
Well, and the risk aversion, it permeates Canadian culture. And I think that has to change, because I'm certain that the moment this election is over, Trump is going to be back on the Annex Canada stuff. Because the more that this China conflict builds, the more that the U.S. hawks gain credibility in what is fundamentally a deterministic belief that conflict with China is certain.
Well, even Carney, to his question, what do you think the greatest threat to Canada is? His answer was just China.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah. Which I find logically understandable, but I feel America's a bigger threat right now due to geographic proximity. Before we spin off from any Canadian election talk, when you were talking about the NDP and their kind of existential battle, I see a parallel which may not be fair that I want to throw at you. What about the Bloc? I mean, obviously, sovereignty in Quebec will never go away, but on the federal stage, the Bloc hasn't been around forever. That doesn't mean they will be around forever. To what extent are they facing a similar risk?
Oh, they are. I mean, we saw how the CAQ were able to undermine them until they started losing their support, since their last election. But a strong nationalist, non-separatist alternative could make the Bloc and the PQ also irrelevant very, very quickly, because what the difference, again, we talked about this as well, is generationally, is that separatists, in the 1980 referendum were all the young people. Yeah. I mean, if you're under 30, you were a separatist. Today, if you're under 30, there's no chance you're a separatist. They're globalists. They want to have a bigger role in the world, not a smaller role in their little province there. And you can see, again, Blanchette, the fact that he only spoke to the parish, that there was no vision, there was no anything beyond the borders of Quebec, being limiting to, some smart young thing who's graduating out of Laval University Law School today, who's perfectly bilingual, who's completely comfortable on a global forum. And, that world is just too small for that kind of person.
Well, and you're talking a generation from 81. I'm thinking multiple generations from Maurice Duplessis.
Yeah.
And it was the Duplessis authoritarianism that really pushed a lot of the sovereigntists initially, because they wanted their independence not just from Canada, but from the church, from the corporations.
In that period of time, if you were a Quebecer, you wanted one of two jobs. You wanted to be a clergyman or a civil servant.
Yeah,
that was it. And you're right. I mean, that's what the Cultural Revolution really was. It was not a fight so much for the French language; it's a fight against the Catholic Church and the authoritarianism of the Duplessis kind of government.
Yeah, and with that existential risk gone, I mean, to your point, there is a little bit of that America, but there is a desire to look outward rather than inward.
Yeah.
And again, the political class has kind of failed to deliver when it comes to that sort of representation. Since I know, I do want to talk about TikTok, as you know, but since I know that Tobias is listening to us right now, any homework you want to assign him for Monday, what do you think we should talk about him with?
Well, I know that his field is much broader than the judicial system, but we've got to get his insights into what the options that the courts have these days in upholding the we talked about this the other day, the fairly strong litany of turndowns that they have imposed on the executive, and just see where that's going. And that we talked also that some of these judges were prepared to issue contempt of courts on, we don't know who yet, but probably the actual lawyers and the legal class, and how that might actually be a deterrent, and whether they have, in their arsenal, other deterrents that could be employed to ensure that there's some adherence to the judgments that they're making.
Well, and I think there is a feeling, not just amongst the judiciary, but amongst the political class, that enough is enough. That
Yeah.
we need to come to a head, and we're encouraged by that. So Tobias may correct us in our naivety, or he seemed rather distressed when he contacted me today. So maybe he's got a darker view of what's happening.
Well, and I also want to talk to him, obviously, because he is an academic and he's right in the midst of this in terms of Harvard's resistance, and more and more universities saying that no, we are independent of the political system, and even though we're part of the larger civil society, we're not going to be pushed around. That we have our own ethos, we have our own edicts, and you can try as you might, and you're not going to change those because they're worth fighting for.
Although Harvard is incredibly wealthy, it's harder for, there's a lot of talk around the historic black colleges and universities.
Yeah.
I would love to see the wealthier universities create a fund, like a strike fund, for some of the poorer universities, out of solidarity to help them get through. I think that would be a very powerful gesture on their part. Briefly before we end, I did want to talk about TikTok, because I mentioned that I think it's going to be a growing source of interest. On the one hand, the Chinese government has made it clear at this point that they will not approve the sale. There are multiple bidders.
Why is that, do you think? Why does China have so much invested? I
think it's a fuck you.
You think that's what it is? Basically?
Right now. I could be wrong.
They say you got 150 million users there. Go fuck them up and see what happens.
Well, I think, again, it's there are multiple layers to this, but I think it is just a casualty currently of the trade war, that it's part of the negotiating of, okay, you're going to do tariffs, then we're going to kibosh your TikTok deal. The Chinese government doesn't care about ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok. But this all could be bluff. It all could be tactics. Because what is interesting was, as soon as the trade war kicked up, a slew of Chinese propaganda campaigns, and I don't mean necessarily Chinese state media, because who knows? These seem to be largely independent, like Chinese individuals, Chinese private entities. The most famous that's gotten traction, which you may have already seen, is an AI-generated video of really obese Americans working in factories making iPhones.
No.
And it's hilarious. Like it's been going viral all around the world.
Send it to me. It sounds hilarious.
I will. And it's multiple versions, right? And the idea being that Americans wouldn't work in factories. They're not, very effective. Others have been showing off Chinese lifestyles, like showing how there's a lot of luxury and a lot of affordability in China. But the biggest and most interesting that has really gotten a lot of press and attention in the US have been Chinese manufacturers, especially luxury manufacturers, showing how cheap it is to make American luxury goods. From fashion to shoes to bags to consumer electronics.
And America makes virtually none of that anymore.
Well, and what's fascinating is this is all a project in literacy, because these guys aren't just doing it for random propaganda. They're doing it to show that if you buy direct, it's still cheaper with 150% tariffs.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of them are logistics specialists, because there's software now, one of the most prominent is called Flexport, that basically allows anyone to get into global shipping and logistics. So they're trying to get mom and pop people to sell their stuff, like at the local corner store or at the dollar store. I don't know if there will be take up, But if there will, this could be a whole new kind of commerce revolution, right? Where, because it's not that difficult anymore. And it could still be profitable in spite of the tariffs, because they're going around traditional industry.
And we saw how quickly that Trump reversed himself on laptops and cell phones. And I don't think that was just because of him wanting to cater to the tech bros. I think that was him saying, people are going to revolt if they have a $3,500 phone. Well, they're going to revolt too if they can't buy a nice pair of shoes, because there's no one in America who's making them.
Yeah.
And short of paying 150% more than you're paying right now, you go barefoot.
Yeah. Although we should say, for the record, there are people making shoes in America. They're just very expensive.
Well, and
because they're handcrafted.
And they're not on a mass basis.
Correct.
To meet the demand, not even close. And again, I think clothing and toys are like 80% Chinese right now in terms of the total purchasing in the United States, just like cell phones and laptops.
Although, interestingly enough, on the clothing piece, if America all of a sudden had a massive aesthetic and cultural shift, there's enough used clothing in America to clothe everybody in perpetuity. But, everyone wants a new shirt, a new blouse, a new look, especially for Coachella. So it's...
well, we've talked about the used market in the face of tariffs, and so maybe that's a whole new thing, was business we should be getting into.
Yeah, I know you never know.
You're into food co-ops now, so that would just be, you could have them next door to each other, used clothes and food co-ops.
Well, it's funny you say that. Here, where I live in Almont, there is a thing called the Hub, and it is like a Salvation Army in terms of clothes.
Huh.
And this is far more prevalent in rural communities, where it's high-end stuff. Like, if you brought your kids there to get like snowsuits, you're getting like pretty decent. Like, there was a period of my life when my dad was doing his PhD when he was dressing me from the Sally Ann.
Right.
And I was a little embarrassed, even though these weren't fat. This is completely different. So many communities do have this stuff. And I think, to our conversation, it'll become more popular, because nothing we've been talking about, nothing that we've talked about in context of the Canadian election or American politics, is actually addressing wealth disparity.
Yeah.
Like, that is still the big political problem that everyone knows. And at some point, hopefully, it gets on the table. Any final thoughts?
No, we say I'm looking forward to Tobias on Monday. I thought we had a very good conversation previously, and that his subject matter expertise is right on top of current affairs right now. So I think that's going to be good. The last week in the campaign, I mean, it's the old maxim, find an issue and make it your issue. I've rarely seen a campaign where you have starker strengths and weaknesses on the part of the major alternatives. So it's not just a question of someone changing their image or their branding or their positioning. It's how salient those aspects of the brand are. And again, if Trump does something nutty on Wednesday, the election's over. Mark Carney. Yet if he kind of goes to sleep, he said some nice things about the EU when he had the Prime Minister of Italy in there the other day. He seems to like her. I don't know particularly well, probably because she's kind of on the right wing of things.
And she's got some Berlusconi styles in terms of she knows how to charm.
Yeah. So again, this last week will always be interesting, because while the Liberal vote is far more efficient than the Conservative vote, lest we forget, they actually lost the popular vote last two elections where they formed minority governments. It'll be down to the wire. It's not going to be a runaway on either side. And
to reinforce your point about it potentially going either way, and my point about we're witnessing really the bottoming out of the category of politics, I think we're going to see a lot of people tune in for the first time in the next week.
Yeah,
I think there's going to be a lot of Canadians who have not been following the election, who've not been following politics, who are going to start feeling the pressure of, oh, yeah, there's an election. I should pay attention. And to your point, if Trump sits out and doesn't interfere, that could lead to any types of new developments. So
the other thing I want to get people to think about a little bit too, because when we talked about this in the context of the provincial election, I mean, I was stunned at the last Ontario provincial election that the NDP, were fully 11 points behind the Liberals in popular vote and ended up with twice as many seats. And there's some evidence in that campaign that incumbent New Democrat members of parliament and provincial legislators are valued more than non-New Democrats. And, as I said, the election projection models say that at 8% of the popular vote, the NDP is down to 5 seats. If they end up with 25 instead of 5, there's a story there that
huge.
But a story that they are missing. That they are better representatives of local constituents than other political parties. And that's also a brand strength that no one has out there. That I'm really for you. Not just like you, I'm really for you. I know you. I live in your community. I fight for your community. You got a problem with your visa, I'll fix it. We've got a problem with our water system. I'll go to the provincial government and municipal government and try to fix it. So I've been watching for that too. It's smaller than the big trends, but it's something again that really.
But it's a big story. I think that would be a big story, and I think I would tack on to that the need for them to abandon party discipline.
Yeah.
That demonstrates they have a tremendous amount of talent within the party that's not being. And Charlie Angus is the poster boy of this. Because he would win handsomely if he won.
He finally quits. He finally quits, and his voice has never been clearer or more persuasive.
His profile. He's now getting global attention.
Right?
Like Canada would have benefited from him being a loudmouth member of parliament, right? So if you are correct that if the power of incumbency means that there are more NDP seats than statistically we would believe, then they better stand up and be that mouthpiece. Although to our original point, the Liberal victory is still not 100%.
No.
And this is where the other thought I had with regard to the NDP incumbency is it still depends on voter turnout. We could see a lot of non-voters showing up to vote Liberal out of a patriotic duty, out of a sense that they're voting for Canada, not Mark Carney.
We saw that in 2015 with young people. There was 3 million more young people, Elections Canada showed, who voted in that election than before because they got really excited about Justin Trudeau. We've talked about young people before, how turned off they are by the whole system. So much so that whoever's radical, even if they're conservatives, they're embracing them quite fulsomely. So you're right. There could be significant segments of the population who historically have been kind of ho-hum about everything, who actually are excited about something or fearful of something, who go out there. And if we get, wouldn't that be great to see turnout again up in the 70s again?
Yeah. Oh, let alone higher. A boy can dream. Now, I could be wrong about this, but that 2015 election, wasn't that also when cannabis was kind of part of the ballot question?
Yes.
Because we shouldn't give Trudeau all the credit for that. No, cannabis, a single issue voting might have.
Little pot might have helped along the way.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, another great episode. A Good Friday. That means that hopefully no Jews are going to be nailed up to a tree tonight and have to come and resurrect themselves by Sunday. I love making that joke. And then there's the Passover jokes. I could go on and on. The best one of theirs is...
Listen. Most Christians are far more interested in the Easter Bunny than they are in the resurrection story. Okay?
But here's the Jewish one. Moses didn't go up to speak to the burning bush. Moses went up and burnt the bush to speak to God, as the Rastas would say. Yes. But yes, back on Monday with Tobias Gibson.
Looking forward to it. Take care, Jesse. Have a nice weekend.
Okay, bye-bye.